The year was 1884, and the silence on Elias Vance's land was a physical thing. It had weight and texture, a heavy blanket woven from grief and solitude that he pulled around himself each morning and slept beneath each night. His ranch was a scratch of human effort against the vast, indifferent canvas of Wyominga, small, sturdy cabin, a weathered barn, and fences that sagged like tired shoulders against the endless sweep of sagebrush and sky. The land was a brutal kind of beautiful, its horizons so wide they seemed to swallow sound before it could travel far. For Elias, this was its primary virtue. The quiet was a tomb for memory, and he was its willing keeper. 5 years had passed since he had buried Martha and their stillborn son at the base of the lone cottonwood tree overlooking the creek. He had chiseled her name into a flat river stone with his own hands, the rasp of steel on rock, the only sound for weeks. Martha. He had not had the heart to add the babies. He hadn't even had a name for him. Since that day, his world had shrunk to the size of his property lines, his conversations limited to the occasional grunted exchange for supplies in the nearest town, a place he visited only when necessity clawed at him. The townsfolk knew him as the widower, the man who lived out on the edge of everything, a ghost haunting his own life. They saw the hardness in his eyes and left him be, which was all he ever asked of them. His days were a metronome of chores, a rhythm that kept the thinking at bay. He rose before the sun painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and pale pinks, his movements economical and sure. He mended fences, tended his small herd of cattle, chopped wood, and cared for his horse, Apollo, a stoic chestnut gelding whose quiet companionship was the only kind Elias could tolerate. In the evenings, he would sit on his porch, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hand, and watch the light bleed from the world. He never lit a lamp until full dark had fallen. He preferred the creeping shadows, the way they blurred the sharp edges of his loneliness into a dull, familiar ache. He was not living, he knew. He was waiting. For what, he could not say. An end, perhaps. An erosion. The same slow, patient work the wind and rain performed on the granite hills. It was after a week of relentless summer rain that the world intruded. The downpour had turned his pastures into a slick green bog and swelled the sluggish creek near his southern boundary into a churning, mud-brown torrent. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the scent of wet earth and sage. Elias rode out on Apollo to check the fences, his mind on the familiar litany of potential damage: washed, outposts, downed wires, the possibility of cattle straying into the hazardous, waterlogged terrain. The sun was a weak, hazy disk in the sky, and the land itself seemed to be holding its breath, exhausted by the storm. He was tracing the creek line, his eyes scanning the treacherous banks when he heard it. It was not a sound that belonged to the wild, not the cry of a hawk or the complaint of a coyote. It was thin, reedy, and desperate. A human sound. Elias reined Apollo in, his body going still, every sense honed by years of solitude. He listened, his head cocked. There it was again, weaker this time, almost swallowed by the gurgle of the water. It came from a marshy inlet 100 yards downstream, a place notorious for its soft, greedy ground, a place he always warned his cattle away from. A knot of reluctance tightened in his gut. This was trouble. Trouble was a complication, a rip in the seamless fabric of his isolation. His first instinct, raw and honest, was to turn Apollo around and ride away. It was not his business. The world and its sorrows were no longer his concern. He had built his walls high and thick for a reason. But then the sound came a third time. A ragged, pleading whimper that scraped against something deep inside him. A piece of the man he had been before Martha. A piece he thought had long since turned to dust. With a low curse that was more a prayer of resignation, he urged Apollo forward, the horse picking his way carefully through the sucking mud. As he drew closer, he saw a splash of color against the dun-colored muck, the deep blue of a beaded dress. And then he saw her. A girl, young, maybe 16 or 17 summers, sunk to her waist in the thick, pulling sludge that was the creek's runoff, Quicksand. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her black hair clinging to her skin in wet strands. She was Cheyenne. He could tell by her dress, her moccasins, one of which was lost to the mire, and the fine, high bones of her face. She had stopped crying out and was just watching him, her dark eyes wide with a terror that was giving way to exhaustion. She was sinking, slowly, but undeniably. For a long moment, Elias simply sat on his horse and stared. She was a world of trouble. A Cheyenne girl on his land, dying. Helping her meant involvement. It meant questions, contact, a breach in the silent treaty he had with the world. But leaving her meant something worse. It meant becoming a man who could watch a child die and do nothing. Even in the depths of his own hollowed-out existence, he was not that man. He could not be. Martha would not have known that man. He swung down from Apollo, his boots sinking into the soft ground. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. The words felt strange in his own mouth. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, not wanting to spook her further. She watched him, her body rigid, a trapped animal assessing a new predator. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, more to himself than to her. He took the lariat from his saddle. It was old, worn smooth by work and weather, an extension of his own hand. He tied one end securely to the thick horn of his saddle, paying out the rope as he cautiously approached the edge of the mire. "Don't struggle," he commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. "The more you fight it, the faster it'll pull you down." She didn't understand his words, he knew, but she seemed to grasp the tone. A flicker of something not trust, but desperate hope stirred in her eyes. He found a fallen cottonwood branch, thick and long, and shoved it out onto the surface of the quicksand as far as he could. "Here," he grunted, pushing it closer to her. "Try to get your arms over this. Spread your weight." She reached for it, her movements clumsy with fear and fatigue. Her fingers scrabbled at the wet bark, finally getting a grip. He saw the strain in her shoulders as she tried to pull herself up, the effort only making her sink a fraction deeper. A soft sob escaped her lips. "All right, hold on," Elias said, his focus narrowing to the task. He made a wide loop in his rope and tossed it, his aim true. It landed neatly over her head and shoulders. "Get this under your arms," he instructed, using hand gestures to show her. She fumbled with it, her cold fingers barely able to work. He waited with a patience he hadn't felt in years, a patience born of necessity. Finally, she had it secured. "All right, Apollo," he called, his voice calm. "Back. Easy now. Back." The great horse, steady as a rock, understood the command. He leaned into his harness and began to back away, step by slow, powerful step. The rope went taut, humming with tension. Elias watched the girl, his hand held up. "Hold on to that log," he yelled. "Hold on." The pull was immense. The quicksand was a greedy, living thing, reluctant to release its prize. The girl cried out, a sharp sound of pain and fear as the rope bit into her, but she clung to the log as the horse strained. For a terrible second, Elias thought it wouldn't work. He saw the life draining from her face, her eyes starting to glaze over. Then, with a thick, sucking slurp that sounded like the earth itself letting out a grotesque belch, she was free. The horse pulled her clear, dragging her through the mud and onto the relative safety of the damp grass. She lay there, a broken doll covered in a thick grey plaster of mud, shivering violently. Elias rushed to her side, untying the rope. He knelt, his knees sinking into the wet ground. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. He gently turned her over. She was conscious, but barely. Her eyes fluttered open, fixing on his face with a dazed, uncomprehending stare. He was a white man, a stranger, and he had just saved her life. The contradiction was plain in her exhausted gaze. He knew he couldn't leave her here. The sun was already beginning its slow descent, and the night would bring a chill that could kill her in this state. Town was too far. The only place was his cabin, his sanctuary, his tomb. The thought of bringing her there, of her presence filling that silent space, felt like a sacrilege. It felt like a betrayal of the perfect, sterile grief he had cultivated for 5 years. But the alternative was unthinkable. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire life, he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp bones and trembling muscle. She made no sound, simply collapsing against his chest, her head lolling onto his shoulder. As he carried her toward Apollo, he looked back at the disturbed patch of quicksand, a scar on the land. He felt like something had shifted inside him, a tectonic plate deep beneath the surface of his soul. The walls he had so carefully built had been breached. The silence was broken. He brought her into the cabin and laid her gently on the cot he used for himself, not sparing a thought for the mud and water that soaked into the thin mattress. The space, which had always felt empty, now felt crowded, charged with her presence. He moved with a stiff, unpracticed urgency, stoking the embers in the hearth and adding fresh wood until a proper fire crackled to life, throwing dancing shadows on the log walls. He filled a kettle with water and set it to boil. The girl, he needed a name for her. Even in his own mind lay still, her eyes closed. He found his cleanest spare blanket, a rough wool thing, and covered her. He couldn't leave her in those wet, muddy clothes. The thought made him profoundly uncomfortable. He was a man who hadn't touched another human being with any gentleness in half a decade. He found a small basin and a clean rag, pouring some of the hot water into it. He hesitated for a long moment, then set it down beside the cot. He couldn't bring himself to do more. He would wait for her to wake. Instead, he retreated to the far side of the small room, taking his post in the worn wooden chair that had been Martha's. From there, he watched the stranger he had pulled from the earth. He saw the delicate line of her jaw, the blue-black sheen of her hair against the pale blanket, and he saw the photograph on the mantelpiece, just over her head. Martha, smiling faintly, her eyes full of a light he had long forgotten. It felt as if two worlds, his past and this intrusive present, were colliding in the suffocating quiet of his home. He felt a sharp, unexpected pang, not of anger, but of profound, aching loss. He had saved this girl's life, but he had no idea how to save his own. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt the terrifying possibility that he might have to try. She slept through the night and into the next day, a deep, healing sleep. Elias watched over her, his own rest fitful. He sat in his chair, the rifle across his lap, though he knew the threat was not from outside. It was from the memories her presence stirred, the feelings of responsibility he had tried so hard to bury. He made a thin broth from dried jerky and wild onions, the smell of it alien in a cabin that usually smelled only of wood smoke and dust. When she finally woke, it was with a small, startled gasp. Her eyes flew open and darted around the unfamiliar room, settling on him with a flash of fear. He stayed in his chair, keeping his movements slow. He gestured toward the bowl of broth he had left on a small crate beside her cot. "Food," he said, the single word sounding loud in the stillness. She pushed herself up slowly, wincing. The wool blanket pooled around her waist. She was still in her muddied dress, now stiff and dry. She eyed the bowl, then him, her gaze wary. He saw the intelligence there, the careful assessment. He wasn't a monster, but he was an unknown, and in her world, the unknown was often synonymous with danger. Finally, hunger won out over fear. She picked up the bowl with trembling hands and sipped the broth, her eyes never leaving his. They spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended, silent truce. He learned that her ankle was sprained, and he fashioned a crude bandage for it from a strip of clean cloth. She learned that he was a man of unbreachable routine, his grief a tangible presence in the room. She would watch him as he stared at the photograph on the mantel, her expression unreadable. Communication was a language of gestures and single words. He pointed to himself, "Elias." She looked at him for a long moment before touching her own chest. "Mesa," she whispered, her voice soft. Her name was Mesa. Giving her a name changed something. She was no longer just the Cheyenne girl. She was a person, with a family somewhere who was surely searching for her, worrying for her. He knew he would have to return her, but he didn't know how. His land bordered theirs, but he had always kept a respectful distance. He had no desire to ride into a Cheyenne camp alone. On the third morning, the decision was taken out of his hands. He was outside, splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort, when Apollo let out a low nicker and pricked his ears toward the east. Elias stilled, his hand resting on the axe handle. He scanned the horizon and saw them, a line of riders, perhaps 5 of them, moving with purpose across the prairie. They were too far to see details, but he knew. It was her people. He felt a cold dread mixed with a strange sense of relief. He straightened up, laying the axe down carefully. He would not meet them with a weapon in his hand. He stood his ground by the woodpile as they drew closer, the drumming of their horses' hooves, a rising thunder that seemed to shake the very air. They were warriors, their faces set and grim, their eyes hard. They pulled up in a semicircle before him, their ponies restless. The man at their center was older, his face a mask of authority and worry, his hair streaked with gray. He wore the bearing of a chief. The cabin door creaked open. Mesa stood there, leaning on the doorframe, her face pale. When she saw the riders, a cry of relief broke from her lips. "Vokin!" She called out, and the name meant White Eagle in her tongue, though Elias did not know it. He only saw the tension in the chief's face break, replaced by a wave of profound relief as he saw his daughter. He swung down from his horse, his eyes never leaving her. But then his gaze shifted, moving from his daughter to Elias, and the hardness returned. He saw a white man, and his daughter, disheveled and lame, emerging from that man's cabin. The conclusion was swift and ugly. His hand went to the knife at his belt. The other warriors shifted, their hands moving to their own weapons. The air crackled with menace. Elias stood his ground. He did not raise his hands. He did not speak. He simply met the chief's gaze, holding it steady. He knew this was the precipice. His life hung on the next few moments, on what a girl he had pulled from the mud would say about him. Mesa saw the danger instantly. She limped forward, ignoring her father's outstretched hand, and stood between him and Elias. She began to speak rapidly in her own language, her voice urgent and clear. She pointed toward the creek, her hands mimicking a struggle, the act of sinking. Then she pointed at Elias and at the rope on his saddle. She pointed back inside the cabin, to the cot and the empty bowl. She lifted her bandaged ankle to show them. Her story tumbled out, a torrent of words that washed over the tense clearing. As she spoke, Elias watched the chief's face. He saw suspicion slowly, painstakingly, give way to understanding. The hard lines around Vokin's eyes softened. He looked from his daughter's earnest face to Elias's stoic one. He saw the quiet cabin, the lack of finery, the profound solitude of the place. He saw the truth. When Mesa finished, silence fell once more, but it was a different kind of silence. The threat had dissipated, replaced by a heavy, thoughtful quiet. Vokin took a step forward. He looked at Elias, his eyes deep and searching, as if trying to read the story of his life in the lines on his face. He spoke, and another, younger warrior translated, his English formal and careful. "She says you pulled her from the swallowing earth. She says you gave her shelter and food. You did not harm her." Elias gave a single, curt nod. "She was in trouble. I helped." The chief, Vokin, studied him for another long moment. Then he gave a nod of his own, a gesture of profound respect. He said something in Cheyenne, and the translator spoke again. "Our law is a law of balance. A life was taken from the earth. A debt is owed. My daughter's life is precious. We will honor the man who saved her." Elias wanted nothing. He wanted them to take the girl and leave, to return him to his silence. "No debt is owed," he said, his voice flat. "Anyone would have done the same." "Not any man," the translator corrected, after a word from the chief. Many would have ridden on, or would have demanded payment. You did not. You are an honorable man. Vokin stepped forward and placed a hand over his own heart, then extended it toward Elias. It was a gesture of peace and gratitude. After a moment's hesitation, Elias mirrored it. They took Mesa with them, her father lifting her onto his own horse. Before she left, she turned and looked at Elias, her dark eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that words could not hold. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and went back to his woodpile as they rode away, the sound of their departure fading back into the vast quiet. He thought that was the end of it. He had been wrong. A week later, they returned. This time, there was no menace in their arrival. Vokin led a small procession, not of warriors, but of his own family. Behind him rode 2 horses, and on them were 2 young women. They were beautiful, with the same fine bones and dark, intelligent eyes as Mesa, who rode beside her father. They led a pack mule laden with gifts, fine tanned hides, blankets woven with intricate geometric patterns, and strings of dried meat and corn. Elias met them in the yard, his face a mask of confusion. He had expected to never see them again. Vokin dismounted, a broad smile on his face. The translator was with him again. "Elias Vance," the young man said, his voice imbued with a ceremonial weight. "Chief Vokin has come to pay the life debt. He has seen your home. He sees you are a man alone. A man without a family, without a wife to warm his lodge, or a son to carry his name. This is a sad and lonely way for an honorable man to live." Elias's gut tightened. He had no idea where this was going, but he felt a deep unease. "I am fine as I am," he stated, his voice low. Vokin ignored him, his smile unwavering. He gestured grandly to the 2 young women who had now dismounted and stood, their eyes cast demurely to the ground. They were stunning, one with a quiet, watchful grace, the other with a spark of defiance in her posture. "These are my other daughters," the translator announced, as if presenting a royal decree. "Vivina and Sotayo. They are Mesa's sisters. They are skilled in the ways of the home. They are strong and will bear strong sons. Chief Vokin, in his gratitude, honors you. He offers you his daughters. He offers them to you as your wives." The words fell into the quiet yard and shattered it. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. Wives, plural. He stared, dumbfounded, at the 2 girls, then at the beaming chief. It was a joke. It had to be some colossal misunderstanding of culture and language, but the solemnity on the chief's face, the expectant hush from the entire party, told him it was no joke. This was real. This was the honor. This was the payment. His mind reeled. 1,000 thoughts crashed into him at once, the sheer impossibility of it, the cultural chasm that yawned between them, wider and deeper than any canyon. And above all, a fierce, protective wave of loyalty to Martha rose in him, hot and sharp as bile. The idea of another woman in his house, in his lifelet alone, too felt like the gravest betrayal, a desecration of the shrine he had built to her memory. The silence stretched, thick with expectation. The 2 girls, Vivina and Sotayo, risked a quick glance at him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and duty. He knew he was in a perilous position. This was not an offer that could be casually brushed aside. This was a chief's gift, a forging of an alliance, a gesture of supreme honor. To refuse it carelessly would be a profound insult, a rejection not just of the women but of their father, their family, their entire people. It could undo all the goodwill he had accidentally earned. It could make him an enemy. He had to find the words, the right words. He took a slow breath, forcing his racing heart to calm. He looked at Vokin, meeting his gaze directly, man to man. He needed to make him understand not just his refusal, but the reason for it. He needed to bridge that chasm, if only for a moment. "Your chief," Elias began, his voice raspy, speaking to the translator but looking at Vokin. "His honor is a mountain. It leaves me breathless. His daughters, They are beautiful. Any man would see that. Any man would be proud to have such a family. He paused, letting the respectful words settle in the air. He saw a flicker of pride in Vokin's eyes. "But I cannot accept this great honor," Elias continued, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more raw. "And I must ask your chief to understand why. It is not a refusal of his friendship. It is not a rejection of his family." He turned and walked the few steps to his cabin door, pushing it open. He pointed to the small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece, the one Mesa had seen him staring at. "There," he said. "That is my wife." Vokin and the translator followed him to the doorway, peering inside. The two sisters, their curiosity piqued, drew closer behind them. They all stared at the image of Martha. "Her name was Martha," Elias said softly. "She died 5 years ago. Our son, he died with her. The admission cost him dearly." He had not spoken those words aloud to another soul. The confession left him feeling stripped bare, exposed. "In my culture, a man has one wife. His heart is given to her. It is a gift, and he does not take it back, even when she is gone." He touched his own chest, his hand flat over his heart. "My heart is with her," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he thought had long since withered. "It is buried with her, under the cottonwood tree on that hill. It does not beat for anyone else. To take a new wife, it would be a lie. It would be a shadow. It would not be worthy of the honor your chief offers me. It would not be worthy of his daughters." He looked from the photograph to Vokin's face. He had no more words, only the stark, painful truth. He had laid his scarred heart bare for them to see, hoping it was enough. An immense silence descended. The translator quietly relayed Elias's words to the chief, his voice soft and respectful. Vokin listened, his gaze fixed on Elias's face, then shifting to the photograph, then back again. The broad, confident smile was gone, replaced by a look of deep, solemn contemplation. He was a man who understood honor, but he also understood loyalty and grief. He saw the truth in Elias's haunted eyes, a truth that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. It was the universal language of loss. Vokin said something low and quiet. The translator nodded. "The chief understands," he said to Elias. "He says a heart that is buried with the dead is a sacred thing. He says your loyalty to your wife is a mark of great strength. It is a song of sorrow, but it is a true song." The chief stepped forward. He looked at his daughters, who were now looking at Elias not with apprehension, but with a newfound, profound respect. He said a few words to them, and they bowed their heads in understanding. He then turned back to Elias. He placed his hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of surprising solidarity. "He says the life debt remains," the translator relayed, "but it will be paid in a different way, not with wives, but with friendship, not with family, but with allies. His people will be your people. Your land will be safe. You will be known in our lodges not as the man who refused a gift, but as the man with one heart. You will not be alone." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Elias. He had navigated the impossible. He had not only avoided insult, but he had forged something new and unexpected in its place. He met Vokin's gaze and saw not a thwarted chief, but an equal, a man who understood. He gave a deep, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, and the words held more meaning than any he had spoken in years. The gifts were still given, not as a bride price, but as a token of this new alliance. Elias accepted them with grace, offering in return 2 of his best blankets and a sack of precious coffee beans from his stores. The transaction was sealed not with a marriage, but with a handshake and a shared look of mutual respect. As they prepared to leave, Mesa approached him. She looked at him, then at the picture of Martha inside. She was beautiful, she said, her English halting but clear. It was the first time she had spoken the language to him. "Yes," Elias said, his voice tight. She was. Vavina and Soteoro, the sisters he had been offered, now looked at him without the weight of obligation. They saw the man, not the potential husband. They saw the depth of his past and the integrity of his present, and in their eyes he saw not rejection, but a quiet, powerful understanding. He watched them ride away until they were once again specks against the vast horizon. He then turned and walked back into his cabin. The air inside no longer felt suffocating. The silence no longer felt like a tomb. Her presence, all of their presence, had not desecrated this space. It had let a little air in, a little light. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the photograph of Martha. He wiped a speck of dust from the glass with his thumb. Her smile seemed less distant, less a relic of a buried past. His loyalty to her had not been a wall to keep the world out, after all. It had been a bridge, a way to connect with another soul who understood the value of a heart given completely. That evening, Elias sat on his porch, but he did not just watch the darkness fall. He watched the last light catch the high peaks in the distance, turning them to gold. The land no longer seemed indifferent. It was still vast and wild, but it was not empty. He had neighbors now, friends. He was still the man who lived on the edge of everything. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It had weight, pressing down on the floorboards and settling in the corners where the dust motes danced in the sparse afternoon light. It was the heavy, settled silence of absence, a quiet hollowed out by years of unfulfilled prayers. Elias McBride felt it most when he came in from the fields, his shoulders aching and his hands raw. He would look at his wife, Martha, and see the same silence reflected in her eyes, a landscape as vast and lonely as the prairie that stretched out from their front door. It was the year 1884, and their small farm was an island in a sea of grass, a testament to 5 years of hard labor that had yielded corn, calluses, and a profound, unshakable loneliness. Martha moved through her days with a quiet competence that masked the ache in her soul. She tended the chickens, kneaded the bread, and mended Elias's shirts with hands that yearned for a smaller, more fragile task. She had long ago packed away the tiny clothes she had sewn in the hopeful early years of their marriage, tucking them into a small wooden chest beneath their bed. But out of sight was not out of mind. Every time a new family settled within a day's ride, the news of a birth would eventually drift to them on the wind, another small twist of the knife in a wound that would not heal. They were good people, kind to the few travelers who passed their way and fair in their dealings, but their life was a two-person play performed on an empty stage, their love for each other, the only anchor against the tide of sorrow. Their routine was the bedrock of their existence. Sunrise brought chores, sunset brought a simple meal, and the darkness brought the crushing quiet. They spoke of the weather, the price of grain, the weakness in the west wall of the barn. They spoke of everything but the one thing that defined them, the empty space at their table, the child's laughter they would never hear echoing against the sod walls of their home. Elias worked the land with a grim determination, turning the soil as if he could bury his grief beneath it. But grief was a stubborn root. It always found its way back to the surface. Then the storm came. It was not the usual summer squall that swept across the plains with a dramatic flourish before moving on. This was different. The sky turned a sickening shade of bruised purple-green, and the air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange electric dread. The wind arrived first as a whisper, then a moan, and finally a demented shriek that clawed at the little cabin, threatening to tear it from its foundations. Rain and hail fell in a solid, blinding sheet, turning the world outside into a churning chaos of noise and violence. For hours, Elias and Martha huddled together by the cold hearth, listening to the world being torn apart. The groan and splinter of heavy timber told them the barn had not survived intact. They did not speak, they simply held on, two small figures against the wrath of a furious God. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a world scrubbed clean and utterly broken. The sky was a pale, innocent blue, a cruel mockery of the night's devastation. Their cornfield was a flattened ruin of mud and broken stalks. The west wall of the barn had collapsed, exposing its splintered ribs to the sky. A profound sense of defeat settled over Elias as he surveyed the damage. It felt like the final, definitive blow, all their work washed away in a single night. He was making his way toward the swollen creek at the edge of their property, checking the erosion on the banks, when he saw it. The ancient, gnarled cottonwood that had stood for generations had been torn from the earth, its massive root system exposed like the nerves of a pulled tooth. Tucked securely within the lattice of thick, dark roots, sheltered from the worst of the storm's fury, was a cradleboard. Elias froze, his mind refusing to process the sight. He approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cradleboard was beautifully made, of wood and stretched hide, adorned with intricate quillwork in patterns he did not recognize, and from within it came a soft, mewling cry. He knelt in the mud, his hands trembling as he reached out. Inside, swaddled in soft rabbit furs, was a baby, a perfect, dark-eyed infant with a thatch of fine black hair, its skin the color of warm copper. It stared up at him, its tiny face wrinkled in consternation, and let out another, more demanding cry. It was a native child, Cheyenne or Arapaho, by the look of the beadwork, left alone in the wreckage of the storm. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone. Just the child, the ruined land, and the deafening silence that had followed the tempest. He lifted the cradleboard, his movements clumsy with awe and terror. The weight of it was both impossibly light and unbearably heavy. He carried the baby back to the cabin, his mind a whirlwind of questions with no answers. When Martha saw him at the door, her face drained of all color. She looked from the destruction outside to the impossible bundle in her husband's arms. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I found him," he said, his own voice hoarse, "by the creek, in the roots of the old cottonwood." He stepped inside and placed the cradleboard on the table. For a long moment, they both just stared. Then, Martha seemed to awaken from a trance. She moved forward, her hands fluttering hesitantly before she reached in and gently lifted the baby from his confines. She held him against her chest, and a sound escaped her throat, a soft, choked sob that was equal parts grief and wonder. The silence in the cabin was broken. It was filled with the sound of a hungry baby's cry, and for the first time in years, it was a sound of life. The deep, hollow ache in Martha's soul was suddenly, miraculously filled. She looked at Elias, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a fierce, protective light dawning in them. In that moment, the ruined barn and the lost crop ceased to matter. The storm had taken nearly everything, but it had brought them this. The first few days were a blur of fearful, tender activity. The baby, they discovered, was a boy. He was healthy and strong, his cries robust, and his appetite fierce. Martha, who had thought her maternal instincts had long since withered and died, found them surging back with the force of a flood. She used the milk from their lone surviving cow, diluting it with boiled water as she'd heard others did, feeding the infant with a rag dipped in the warm liquid. She bathed him in the basin, her hands gentle on his soft skin. She sang to him, quiet, half-forgotten lullabies that came back to her like echoes from a distant dream. A light returned to her face that Elias had not seen since they were first married. Elias, however, remained on edge. He was a practical man, a man who understood cause and effect, and the baby's presence defied all logic. He found himself constantly scanning the horizon, watching the empty line where the prairie met the sky, expecting to see riders appear at any moment. "They'll come for him, Martha," he said one evening, his voice low as he watched her rock the baby by the fire. "His people, they won't have just left him." "The storm," Martha whispered, not taking her eyes off the boy's sleeping face. Perhaps they were caught in it. Perhaps they couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. He was placed in that tree to be safe. It was an act of love, Elias, not abandonment. Maybe, he conceded, but the worry didn't leave his eyes. To take in a white child found in such circumstances would be one thing, but this was different. He knew the fear and mistrust that ran like a poisoned river between the settlers and the tribes. To be found with a native child, no matter the circumstance, could be seen as theft, as a crime. Yet, even as he worried, he found himself being drawn into the child's orbit. The baby's grip on his calloused finger was surprisingly strong. The way his dark eyes followed Elias around the small cabin chipped away at his reserve. One afternoon, while Martha was outside, he found himself sitting by the makeshift cradle, carving a piece of scrap wood into the rough shape of a bird. He didn't even realize he was doing it until the toy was finished. He placed it gently beside the sleeping infant, his heart giving a painful lurch. He was already lost. They fell into a new routine, one punctuated by the needs of the child. The silence of grief was replaced by a new kind of quieter, watchful, waiting peace. They didn't dare name him at first, as if doing so would be to claim something that was not theirs. They simply called him the boy. But as days turned into a week, and then two, with no sign of anyone on the horizon, the name felt increasingly wrong. One evening, Martha looked up from feeding him, her expression solemn. "His name is Daniel," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, of faith. He was delivered from the flood. Elias looked at her, at the fierce love burning in her gaze, and then at the child held so securely in her arms. He saw the truth of it. This was their son now, in their hearts, no matter what came next. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Daniel," he repeated, the name feeling solid and right on his tongue. He finally let the hope, so long suppressed, bloom in his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future with a son, to teach, to raise, to leave this land too. The day it happened, the air was still and clear. Elias was working to salvage timber from the ruined barn when he felt it prickling on his skin, the instinct of a man who has lived long in open spaces. He looked up toward the low ridge that bordered their property to the north, and his blood ran cold. They were there, a line of riders, at least a dozen, sitting motionless on their horses. They were too far to see clearly, but he knew. Their stark silhouettes against the bright sky were unmistakable. Cheyenne warriors. They weren't attacking, they weren't making any threatening gestures, they were simply watching. A wave of pure terror washed over him. He dropped his hammer and ran for the cabin. "Martha," he yelled, his voice tight with panic. "Get inside. Bring Daniel. Bolt the door." She saw the look on his face and didn't question him. She snatched Daniel from his cradle, her movements swift and sure, and retreated into the dim interior of the cabin. Elias followed, his rifle in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He peered through a crack in the shutters. They hadn't moved. A silent, terrifying jury assembled on the hill. The vigil lasted the rest of the day. They did not approach. They did not leave. They were a constant, menacing presence that shrunk the world down to the four walls of the cabin. Every plan Elias had made, every hope he had allowed himself to feel, crumbled into dust. They had come for their child, and what would follow? Accusations, vengeance. He held the rifle, but he knew it was a useless token against so many. He and Martha were utterly, hopelessly alone. Night fell, and the silhouettes on the ridge melted into the darkness, but their presence remained, a palpable weight in the air. Elias and Martha didn't sleep. They sat in the dark, Daniel sleeping fitfully between them, and listened. Every rustle of the wind, every cry of a distant coyote sounded like approaching footsteps. The love they felt for the child was now inextricably bound with a paralyzing fear. "What do they want, Elias?" Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "They've come for him," he said, the words tasting like ash. "They were just waiting, watching us." He imagined them seeing his clumsy attempts at repair, their life of struggle. Perhaps they thought their child deserved better, or worse, perhaps they thought the worst of them. The sun rose the next morning on the same scene. The riders were back in their positions on the ridge, as if they had never left. The tension in the cabin had become a physical thing, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. Elias looked at Martha's pale, exhausted face. He looked at Daniel, so small and innocent of the silent war being waged over him. He could not live like this. They could not spend the rest of their lives, however short they might be, cowering in their own home. He made a decision. It was born not of courage, but of desperation. He stood and placed the rifle against the wall. "What are you doing?" Martha breathed, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm going out there," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. We can't live like this. I have to talk to them." "They'll kill you." "Maybe," he said softly, "but hiding in here is its own kind of death." He touched her cheek, then laid a gentle hand on Daniel's head. "Stay inside. Keep the door bolted, no matter what happens." He unbolted the door and stepped out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. He felt 100 eyes on him. He consciously kept his hands open and away from his body, a universal gesture of peace he prayed they would understand. He did not walk toward them with his head held high like a challenger, nor did he crawl like a beggar. He simply walked, one steady step after another, a farmer on his own land, going to meet his fate. As he neared the base of the ridge, one of the riders dismounted and walked down to meet him. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of seasons and sorrows, his long hair braided with gray. He carried no weapon in his hands. He stopped a dozen feet from Elias. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Elias swallowed, his throat dry. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "The boy, we found him after the storm. He was alone. We have cared for him." The Cheyenne man, Vokin, did not seem to understand his words, but he understood the tone. His gaze was intense, searching. He looked past Elias, at the small cabin, at the ruined barn, at the flattened fields. Then he raised a hand and made a series of slow, deliberate gestures. He pointed to the sky and swept his arm in a violent circle, mimicking the wind, a storm. He then pointed toward the creek, to the spot where the great cottonwood had fallen. He made a shape with his hands like a sheltering tree, then held his arms as if rocking a baby. Finally, he looked at Elias, a question in his unblinking eyes. Elias understood. He nodded, pointing to himself and then to the cradle board, which was resting just inside the cabin door, visible from where they stood. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We found him." Vokin watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned without a word and walked back up the ridge to his men. Elias stood frozen, watching them confer. He had done all he could. He braced himself for the charge, for the violent reclamation of the child. He closed his eyes, expecting the end. But it didn't come. Instead, after a few minutes, the entire group of riders turned their horses and rode away, disappearing over the ridge as silently as they had appeared. Elias stood trembling, awash with a disbelief so profound it felt like a dream. He stumbled back to the cabin, his legs weak with relief. They were gone. They had left the boy. They had left them in peace. He and Martha held each other, weeping with a relief that was painful in its intensity. They had been judged, and somehow they had been spared. They thought it was over. They awoke the next morning to a strange sound. It was not the sound of wind or animals. It was the rhythmic, unfamiliar sound of work. Cautiously, Elias went to the door and peered out. His jaw fell open. The prairie was alive with people. The entire Cheyenne party had returned, but they were not on the ridge. They were on his farm, and they were working. A group of men, stripped to the waist, were swarming over the collapsed barn. With an efficiency that was both beautiful and unnerving, they were clearing the debris, salvaging usable timber, and setting aside the broken pieces. Another group was already starting to raise a new frame where the wall had collapsed. In the ruined cornfield, the women moved in a silent, graceful line, their hands methodically gathering any salvageable ears of corn the storm had missed and clearing the broken stalks. They worked without speaking, a community moving as one organism, their movements economical and purposeful. Elias and Martha stood in the doorway, utterly stunned into silence. This wasn't an attack, it wasn't a threat, it was help. They were rebuilding the farm. The silent vigil on the ridge had not been a threat, it had been an assessment. They had been watching the strangers who had their child, judging their character, their home, their circumstance. They had seen not kidnappers, but a poor farmer and his wife. They had seen people who were also victims of the same storm that had likely taken the life of Daniel's mother, leaving her only enough time to secure her son in the cradleboard and tuck him into the roots of the tree, her last desperate act of love. The realization washed over Elias with the force of a physical blow, humbling him to his very core. His fear, his suspicion, it all seemed so small and shameful now. These were not the faceless savages of frontier paranoia. They were people. They had lost one of their own, but they saw that her child had found a new home, and in an act of staggering grace, they had come not to take, but to give. After a long while, Martha, her face streaked with tears of awe, took a deep breath. She went back inside, picked up Daniel, and walked out into the sunlight. She moved with a purpose that mirrored the Cheyenne women in the field. She walked slowly toward an older woman who seemed to be directing the others. The woman, whose name was Mesa, had eyes that held the same deep sorrow and resilience as the land itself. She stopped her work and watched Martha approach. Martha stopped before her, holding Daniel out, not as an offering, but as an introduction. Mesa looked at the baby, her weathered face softening. She reached out a gentle hand and touched Daniel's cheek. Then her gaze lifted to meet Martha's. In that look, a universe of understanding passed between them. There was grief for the daughter she had lost, gratitude for the safety of her grandchild, and an acceptance of the strange, new path his life had taken. She gave a small, solemn nod. It was a blessing, a relinquishment, a recognition of one mother to another. For 3 days, the Cheyenne worked. They spoke little to the McBrides, and Elias and Martha, understanding this was a language of action, not words, did not intrude. They simply brought out water and what food they could share. The offerings were accepted with quiet nods. The barn was not just patched, but made stronger than it had been before. The ruined field was cleared and made ready for a late-season planting. A massive pile of firewood was chopped and stacked by the cabin, enough to last them through the coming winter. On the morning of the 4th day, they were gone. They vanished as they had arrived, leaving behind a repaired farm and an altered world. Elias and Martha walked through their property as if seeing it for the first time. It was the same land, but it was no longer an island. They were connected now, in a profound and sacred way, to the people who truly belonged here. Months later, as the first snows of winter began to dust the prairie, the cabin was warm and filled with a new kind of silence. It was the peaceful quiet of contentment. Elias sat by the fire, mending a piece of harness, while Martha hummed softly, rocking Daniel's cradle. He looked over at them, at the family he never thought he would have, in the home that had been rebuilt by an act of impossible kindness. The fear and the prejudice he had carried within him had been scoured away, replaced by a deep and abiding humility. They had been given more than a repaired barn. They had been given a lesson in grace. They had learned that community was not defined by the color of one's skin or the language one spoke, but by the shared burdens of hardship and the unexpected capacity of the human heart for compassion. The storm had brought devastation, but it had also cleared the way for a new life, a life of earned peace, a life of belonging. And in the center of it all was their son, Daniel, a bridge between two worlds, a living symbol of hope taking root in the most unlikely soil.